Well, now, if we are to achieve the favorable end of the scale, then I'm arguing there has to be widespread acceptance of what I call a new moral order. That is, we have to have a widespread development of the kind of values and preferences which will take us to the favorable end of the spectrum rather than the unfavorable one. Because this is going to depend on decisions. It's going to depend on decisions of 4.25 up to 8 billion people. That is, nobody plans anything. The idea that the world is governed is an illusion, just as much as the idea that the United States is governed is an illusion. I mean, that is, we may think that the steering wheel, friends, but there ain't no rudder, really, and that really the world is an ecological system, and ecological systems are ungoverned. The biologists may call that thing out in the woods a community, but it never elected a mayor. And out in the woods, you've got free private enterprise beyond the dreams of Milton Friedman. Now, of course, here we do have government. There is government. I was exaggerating for the sake of effect. But on the whole, where we're going to go is much more like a shoal of fish than it is a guided missile. This decision, that decision, this decision, that decision, this decision. But on the other hand, if there's a nice smell, and all the fish go this way, don't they? See, it is that decisions depend particularly on the moral environment. So this is why these mysterious changes in the moral environment have such an enormous impact on human history, far greater than anything else, I would say. Then the question is, of course, what? That is, to reach a favorable future requires good luck and good management. We can't do anything about good luck, but good management perhaps we can, and that means better decisions rather than worse. That means, first place, realistic images of the future, and it means a kind of preferences that end you up this side rather than that side. Yeah, it is, which is the moral climate, the moral order. Now, what are the components of the minimum necessary new moral order to achieve the mature rather than the catastrophic society over the next 100 years? I would say a beginning would be a much more widespread adoption of the essential values of the scientific community. That is, which I argue are 3 or 4 maybe. First of all, a high value on veracity. As are not telling lies. The devil really is the father of lies, I mean, that is, and science developed out of a culture of veracity, and still is. The one thing that'll get you excluded from the scientific community is to be caught out in telling a deliberate lie about your results. And that's the end. Then the other thing is a high value on curiosity. That is a passion for better knowledge of the real world and a belief that there is a real world, which I sometimes wonder about, and which will answer you if you ask it the right questions. That's very important. Then the third thing relating to this is asking the right questions, listening to the answers. That is a reliance on testing rather than on authority. Although we don't always follow this in graduate schools, I must say. But anyway, the theory of the scientific community that it is true not because Aristotle or even Einstein said so, but because you asked the real world and it answered you. And then the fourth thing is the principle that people should be persuaded by evidence and not by threat, which also isn't always held to in our graduate schools. And that in the scientific community, it's crucial. That is, this no inquisition. See, it is that the evidence must speak for itself, and you don't establish a scientific theory by saying, if you don't believe this, I will clobber you. And this extraordinary abstention from threat is the thing, I think, which really created science. Well, now, as I say, these principles are rare, in the political community. But they are responsible for the success of science, and if these can spread, then it seems to me we have a better chance getting to the mature society. On the other hand, the scientific values aren't enough. Science is a subculture. It isn't a whole culture. And nobody is a pure scientist. If he is, his wife will divorce him. Irene, you have to go beyond the ethics of science if you're going to be a human being, and we have to think about what I call the identity values. That is, what we value in the character of a person, in ourselves as well as in others. Who are our heroes, really? That's essentially what it says. You see, who do we model ourselves on? Who are our models? And that we also have to think about, because some models lead over there and some models lead over there. See, Napoleon leads over there, I'm quite sure. You see, Einstein gets over there a little more. You see, it is well, what are these identity values? Well, I would say the willingness to learn and the transcendence of anger, extremely important. It's very hard to make any good decisions if you're angry. On the other hand, you shouldn't suppress anger either, so you have I pass that over to the psychology department. I don't know quite what the answer to that one. I would emphasize the love of good rather than the hatred of evil. It is the great vice of radicals is they hate evil and they don't know what good they love. The trouble with conservatives is they tend to love rather inferior goods, like their own satisfaction. But the hatred of evil is enormously corrupting, both individually and politically, I would say, and creates a tremendous amount of difficulty in the world. Now, I wouldn't rule it out altogether, because it generates steam, but without the love of good, it becomes a destructive explosion rather than an engine for advancement. And if you want an example of this, Cambodia is just the absolutely total example, isn't it? Then I suggest that we have to have an image which is neither self-centered nor self-hating. You have to have an image which goes beyond your skin, obviously. You have to have concern for the larger world. On the other hand, though, he who hates himself can't love others. Very fundamental. It is no real development, it seems to me, comes out of self-hatred. This is, again, like the hatred of evil again. That is, you're evil, but you have to forgive yourselves, you see, be a bit of a Methodist or something. That is, then as I say, one of the greatest sources of misery is malevolence, taking satisfaction in the diminution of the welfare of others. Another important principle is to look to the future rather than the past. As, again, Mr. Jevons said, bygones are bygones in economics. And I only wish they were in politics, and you only wish the Irish would learn this, and the Lebanese, and the Cypriots, and almost everybody. It is, my great political motto is forget the Alamo. It is, and start from where you are and look to the future, because we are crippled by the misdeeds of the past. Well, another aspect, I think, is the love of variety and tolerance. And the other thing is to be willing to be satisfied with a minimum necessary. See, it is, if you want all or nothing, you know the answer to that one. You'll get nothing. It is, so you have to be prepared to take the second best very often and compromise, you see, and all this stuff. Well, now, how this fits into the moral teachings of the world religions is a study, I think, of great importance. It's the irony, one of the great ironies of the world, I think, is the society that comes closest to the new moral order is Japan. which has a very peculiar religious structure, as you know. And yet, certainly this extraordinary resurgence of Japan, I think, is a result of the fact that after this colossal catastrophe, and instead of indulging in self-pity and the hatred of others, and saying, oh, how miserable we are, and how nasty everybody has been to us, they sort of said, oh, well, you made a mistake, too bad, back to the old drawing board, boys. This is extraordinary mental health, and you contrast this with other cultures, which I will not name, but you can also suggest, which are just crippled by this old hatreds, all this horrible sense of the ancient injustices of the past that just absolutely cripple the present and destroy the future. So I'm not suggesting it's all Japanese, but we all have a lot to learn from them, as well as our automobile manufacturers. And that it has to be each culture will have to translate a new moral order into its own language and its own symbolism, and get it out of its own religion, in a sense. But that something like this, I'm pretty sure, has to happen if we're to get to the mature society instead of to catastrophe. Thank you.
Our first responder will be Professor Ross Talbot, Professor of Political Science, Iowa State University.
Professor Boulding, ladies and gentlemen. Some years ago, George Simmel commented that the function of a philosopher was to articulate for us what we already know. What he meant, of course, was that we really didn't know until the idea or concept was explained to us. Professor Boulding has enabled me to understand, at least in general outline, several ideas and issues that were foggy in my mind, although I must admit that several pockets of fog remain, too. Those of us who over the years have been his admiring students, so to speak, have come to expect that this Gamaliel will lead us down the path of enlightenment. To paraphrase what T.V. Smith used to tell us about judges and lawyers, Professor Boulding is first a philosopher, both of the humanities and of the sciences. Secondly, he is a poet, and lastly, an economist. And I say that based on a substantial and growing admiration for the science and art of economics. His scope and depth of vision is truly exceptional. In this age of leadership scarcity, and on this historic day, we might even initiate a new movement, Boulding for President in 1984. Although I regret to inform you that he is not eligible constitutionally. Parenthetically, I do feel somewhat tantalizing the thought that we could change the United States Constitution, and that would enable the United States to have a really first-rate presidential campaign, Kenneth Boulding versus Henry Kissinger. To return to the serious, and here these are just sort of isolated notes of appreciation, I guess we might call them. In other words, I haven't really tried to make any transition in this particular paragraph. To return to the serious, I definitely plan to use this paper in my courses on environmental politics. The prophets of gloom and doom are exhausting my patience long before there will be an exhaustion of natural resources. I never have and do not yet really understand the concept of entropy, but I'm much attracted to the more positive laws of diminishing and renewable potential. His guarded optimism concerning the breeder reactor somewhat surprises me. During his last visit to our campus, he led me to believe that the French were headed down a very muddy road, but perhaps I misunderstood him. His discussion of values and valuations were enlightening and challenging. I will surely bring them into a few of my lectures with or without attribution. And my list of ideas and interpretations to eulogize could easily be extended. But I assume that a commentator should also be a critic, and preferably one who admires brevity and conciseness, so permit me for a couple of minutes to play that role. Political scientists are often accused of being overly concerned with the short run, lacking in vision and perspective, too inclined toward what is possible incrementally. And the criticisms are surely not without merit. However, what worries me about Professor Boulding's talk is his emphasis on the 21st century. My concern is much more immediate. What can be done to ensure that at least a fairly high degree of probability that the transition decades, 1980 to 90, 1990 to 2000, will be such that we will avoid an East-West military conflict, and that in North-South relations we will develop and implement a program for survival, to use the subtitle of the Brandt Commission report. To be sure, Professor Boulding had some prudent and penetrating insights concerning those transitional decades, but the overflight was too swift and sketchy. In a nutshell, I would love to believe that we are moving toward a mature world, as envisaged by Professor Boulding, although his use of the phrase, a new moral order, struck some terror into my soul. Forthcoming was a prayer of sorts. Oh God, not another new moral order. I really am more of an optimist than was Thomas Hobbes, but I do believe we must keep his fundamental premise firmly, at least in the back of our minds. And that is, man is single, nasty, solitary, brutish, and short. Scratch a civilized man, quote, or woman very deeply, and that is what you will likely find. But I should close on a positive note. Perhaps we have discovered at least a short-run solution, a Boulding-Kissinger ticket for 1984. Two seminal minds learning from the intelligence of the other and acting in tandem. Thank you.
The second respondent will be Wallace Ogg, Professor Emeritus of Economics, Iowa State University.
We have, I think, a special blessing here in relation to Professor Boulding. We get quite a bit more than our share of the traveling he does, speaking out of the place where he lives, because he likes Ames. I just know that, and I feel very good about it. And so I think we have been honored to have him, and he's honored us with a scholarly and objective presentation of economic implications of living in the age of limits. And he didn't, as you notice, confine himself just to economics. As he indicated in the lecture, about 15 years ago, he wrote a little book entitled The Meaning of the 20th Century. The Great Transition is the subtitle. It's a very profound little book which does just what its presumptuous title says. It is his expression of what the meaning of the 20th century really is. A very dramatic transition from the civilization as we have known it to what he calls post-civilization. This transition has been made possible by what we have learned about planet Earth and its resources and our own capacities from the growing inventory of science and what we can produce in material goods and power from its applications in technology. Now, about 10 years ago, Kenneth was here on the campus, and he was briefly meeting with a few of us in the department who'd known him when he was here earlier. Let us have a kind of confidential visit with him, and I expressed appreciation for the book and asked him what he would address his mind to next. And he thought a minute, and he said, this was just after the first of the Club of Rome reports, and he said, I'd better begin to think about the 21st century. There you are, Ross. He's working on that, and this speech is evidence. For us today, he documents the remarkable expansion of the last 200 years and reasons why the expansion may be coming to an end. He mentions the whole generation of Jeremiahs, the prospect of the exhaustion of cheap oil and other resources that has spawned. I kind of wish he'd been to the theologian's report today because I'm quite sure he met, that's Professor Freudenberger. I think he met Kenneth's qualifications for Jeremiah. He takes what I would call a moderate stance, but doesn't leave us comfortable. In the book written 15 years ago, he said we must emphasize there's no inevitability and no determination in making this great transition. He identified the 3 traps that he mentioned today that may prevent the great transition from grinding poverty and drudgery and the transition to new capacity for man and taking place. And these are, and he mentioned them as you notice, the entropy trap, which, as he said, involves both the exhaustion of resources and the exhaustion of, he worded in the paper, storehouses of pollution. Then the population trap and the war trap. Now, none of these leave me comfortable, and I want to talk about them just a little bit. Because you see, he's still talking about them. With all the warnings on scarce energy and the environment, we seem to have literally be going down the road, ignoring the needs of conservation and alternatives. Prices, as he's indicated, have exercised some restraint, and perhaps the entropy trap can be avoided sufficiently only to delay the transition. The last lecture I heard Professor Boulding give here was specifically on energy. He said he was optimistic about our ability to find a good solution in the next 200 years. It was the intervening time he was anxious about. Now, why are you complaining about just 2100, I'm sorry, I get it out after a while. That's much closer than those 200 years he talked about. On the population trap, we've made some progress in the last 15 years. There's been progress that I think is quite remarkable in the Republic of China, some other Asian nations, and especially in Indonesia. These hold out some hope. But progress on population control is starting very late. Now there's something I want to say that may be offensive to some of my Catholic friends here. Not all of them. But I think I need to say it. And that is, I think non-Catholic Christians are much too reticent to speak out on what they must believe about the urgency of the need for population control. And I was really disturbed today in Professor Freudenberger's lecture that in all the talk about the dreadful things that are going to happen in the world and the awfulness of poverty in the world and the awfulness of people's situation in the third world, there was not one mention about the need for us to practice what we know and help poor people who don't know it to practice population control. As Boulding says, I think that we have repopulated the world. Now, the war trap, perhaps I'm a little more optimistic than Professor Boulding about the danger of nuclear war. I believe that there is an uneasy stalemate that could be exploited by the United States, by Russia and China for the beginning of unilateral disarmament and without danger from each other. I suspect he believes that too. Unfortunately, though, the United States seems to be in another frenzied state of arms buildup instead. And that's not optimistic. Now, on the basis of what has happened, this all leaves me feeling very much like Jeremiah. We seem to be bent on frustrating Professor Boulding's great transition. Now, in closing, I'd like to respond, and I really didn't know that the student body was helping sponsor this program here today, or I maybe would have had second thoughts about it because I don't really want to intervene in freedom of religion in a public university. But I decided I should, as an economist, respond, but also I should try to respond as a Christian. I'm a member of one of the sponsoring churches, First Christian Church, and it seems appropriate to make that kind of response. Depressing as the election has been, I think Christians can't cop out. We do have representative government, and we have an inescapable responsibility the early New Testament church didn't have. And I was interested in Professor Boulding's comments about the new moral order. Now, I don't have quite the same fear you do about it because he put it in a different context. But the history of our participation, Christians' participation in this representative government nation has not been hasn't been very encouraging. The example that I'd like to use is the war between the states over slavery. I think it's an example of Christian ends that were genuine Christian ends and ghastly means. And I think the New Testament is often ignored in our feeble and sometimes disastrous attempts to participate as Christians in our public life. But the principles, I think, are there. It's easy to ignore God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty and I think judgment. Judgment tends to be thought of in terms of things that are dramatic and supernatural, but I think the vast majority of cases of judgment, even in Scripture, are just the results of what people did and what they got themselves into by doing it. And very often, I think judgment cleans things up. It's a costly way to do it, but it does give us a chance for a new start. Now, so I really think we can have quite a little bit more confidence than I've heard expressed many times by the people who are very pessimistic in God's sovereignty, and we can pray. Now, one of the critical things about praying, of course, is that then we have to be willing to do whatever we might be able to do at whatever cost. And I think Jesus certainly taught a very simple, generous, non-covetous lifestyle with everything that we possess available for his disposal. That's not the way we live, but this would be very fitting and proper in your new, the one that goes out here to the right. And he taught and demonstrated a willingness to be provocatively ridiculous in the eyes of both other Christians in the world about generosity and simplicity. It was unpopular. He taught and demonstrated a willingness to be tough-minded. Candidates for tough-mindedness are social justice, the urgency of population control that I've already mentioned, and the economic and physical disaster of arms production, sale, and competition. So I'd like to end on what I'd call a kind of a optimistic note. We aren't powerless as Christians. It's just that the power we have available demands a very scary lifestyle.
Professor Boulding and the responders will briefly join us down here. We will open it up to some limited questions and comments. We do need to end in time to get home to Walter Cronkite and see what the nation did on this day. So grab another chair up here.
Market structure is such that